Whispers from a Fallen Age. Picture the world around 1200 BCE, in the twilight of the Bronze Age. Across the eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms rose like constellations, each brilliant, powerful, and interlinked in a delicate web of trade and diplomacy. The Egyptians held sway along the Nile, the Hittites commanded Anatolia, the Mycenaeans flourished in the Aegean, and the port city of Ugarit bustled with merchants who brought tin, copper, and exotic luxuries from as far away as Afghanistan and Spain. This was a world that seemed, at least from the vantage point of its rulers, eternal, anchored in prosperity and stability. But beneath the polished surface of palaces and temples, the system was fragile. Bronze itself, the lifeblood of this age, depended on rare ingredients scattered across continents. If one link in the chain snapped, everything trembled. Modern archaeologists often compare this ancient network to globalization today, interconnected, resilient in appearance, yet vulnerable to sudden shocks. A drought, a famine, or a disruption at sea could ripple outward, toppling economies and kings alike. Among the ruins, we find solid facts. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, once teeming with scribes and soldiers, was abandoned around 1200 BCE. The walls remain, but its libraries fell silent. Clay tablets tell us of treaties and gods, yet the final years are eerily mute. Scholars still debate whether this was the consequence of war, famine, or a mixture of both, but the silence speaks volumes. And then there are the quirks, the oddities that make history feel alive. In Cyprus, excavators uncovered a layer of ash above a destroyed settlement, and within it, a toy chariot made for a child, its wheels frozen in time, as though play was interrupted by catastrophe. It is a reminder that behind the great shifts of history, families lived ordinary lives, until suddenly they didn't. We must also acknowledge the murmur of mystery. Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples, that enigmatic force whose story we are about to follow, were the cause of these upheavals, or merely opportunists riding the wave of collapse already in motion. Were they raiders sweeping in from the sea, or refugees escaping chaos elsewhere? The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. So we begin at the edge of twilight, in a world bright with trade and ambition, yet shadowed by vulnerabilities no ruler could see clearly. Like the hush before a storm, the Bronze Age gave no warning of its own end. Only later, in crumbling inscriptions and burned-out cities, would whispers tell of the storm's arrival. The shadowy invaders appear. The first hints of the Sea Peoples enter history not as clear portraits, but as shadows. In ancient Egyptian texts from the late 13th century BCE, we find scattered references to peoples of the sea arriving in sudden waves, threatening the very edges of civilization. They appear abruptly, without introduction, as if history itself struggled to describe them. To the Egyptians, these outsiders were strange and terrifying. Warriors who came from unknown coasts, their names preserved in lists like shards of a broken mirror. The Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Looker. Each name survives in carved hieroglyphs, but their origins remain elusive. One solid fact anchors us: the reign of Pharaoh Meneptah, son of the famous Ramesses II. Around 1208 BCE, Meneptah fought off an incursion by a coalition that included Libyans and groups the Egyptians labelled as Sea Peoples. Reliefs at Karnak record this clash, describing enemies coming boldly, their hearts confident. Yet the details are frustratingly vague. Were these raiders from distant islands or dispossessed wanderers from closer shores? Scholars still debate whether these first encounters were mere border skirmishes or the opening tremors of a much larger crisis. Archaeology sometimes gives us quirky hints. In Sardinia, statues known as the Giants of Monte Prama depict warriors with round shields and horned helmets, strikingly similar to the gear later attributed to the Sea Peoples. Could these be distant cousins, or even members of the same confederation? The resemblance fuels speculation, though timelines and contexts are difficult to align neatly. The Egyptians, for their part, seemed unsure how to categorize these newcomers. They were not described as a single empire or kingdom, but rather as a loose confederation, different groups bound by some shared destiny upon the sea. This sets them apart from the enemies Egypt was used to facing, who usually came from established states with predictable patterns of war and peace. Instead, the Sea Peoples appeared as if from nowhere, a rolling tide without borders or a capital. Scholars still debate whether these early references mark the beginning of mass migrations driven by famine and climate stress, or whether they describe professional warriors, mercenaries who had long been part of Mediterranean conflict, now swelling in number. The truth may be an uneasy mix of both, desperate families carried in ships alongside hardened fighters. For the scribes who etched the names into stone, these figures were something alien, unsettling, and unfamiliar. They were written not as distant curiosities, but as direct threats, looming just beyond Egypt's well-guarded borders. And so, in the flickering torchlight of temples, their story begins, not with clarity, but with fear, Egypt's carved warnings. If the Sea Peoples first brushed against history in the reign of Merneptah, their most vivid appearance comes a generation later, under Pharaoh Ramesses III. On the sandstone walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, near Thebes, the story of their great invasion is told in carved reliefs and hieroglyphs, an ancient record as dramatic as any modern epic. There, in intricate scenes still visible today, Egyptian artists etched the clash between the Nile's defenders and these enigmatic sea-born invaders. One solid fact is striking. Around 1177 BCE, Ramesses III confronted a vast coalition of sea peoples who attempted to invade Egypt itself. The inscriptions proudly proclaim Egypt's survival. They describe strange ships, crowded with warriors, and the pharaoh's armies standing firm along the riverbanks. Egyptian archers, bows drawn taut, rained arrows on boats, while chariots wheeled along the shores. The invaders were crushed, and Ramesses presented himself as the guardian of civilization against chaos. Yet the reliefs contain curious details. The Sea Peoples are shown with distinctive feathered headdresses, horned helmets, and ox-drawn wagons carrying families, men, women, and children alike. This suggests something more complex than a mere army. These were not simply raiders, they seemed to be whole communities on the move, arriving in waves that mixed war with migration. The images blur the line between invasion and exodus. Scholars still debate whether Ramesses' victory was as decisive as his inscriptions claim. Egyptian texts, by tradition, rarely admitted weakness. Was this truly the crushing defeat of an external enemy, or was it a temporary repulsion of people desperate for land? The truth is elusive, hidden beneath royal propaganda. Some archaeologists suggest that while Egypt survived intact, other regions, less centralized and less fortunate, crumbled under similar pressures. A quirky twist emerges from the reliefs themselves. Among the depicted prisoners are men with long, curling locks and patterned kilts, unlike typical Egyptian enemies. Some researchers see echoes of Aegean styles, perhaps linking these groups to Mycenaean Greece. Others argue they may be echoes of Cypriot or Anatolian traditions. The very diversity of their attire hints at a coalition drawn from multiple corners of the Mediterranean, bound by necessity or shared opportunity. And yet, despite Ramesses III's victory, the fact remains, many of Egypt's neighbours did not withstand the tide. Within decades, entire kingdoms collapsed or vanished, their cities burned or abandoned. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, carved in triumph, stand as both a warning and a mystery. They tell us Egypt endured, but they also whisper of a wider disaster engulfing the world beyond its borders. Cities to ashes, Beyond the carved victories of Egypt, the wider Mediterranean tells a different, darker story. Across Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean, archaeologists have uncovered unmistakable signs of devastation. Once thriving cities lie in ruin, their walls toppled, their palaces blackened with fire. Around 1200 BCE, a great wave of destruction swept through the region, leaving behind what we now call the Bronze Age collapse. One solid fact shines from the earth. The city of Ugarit, a glittering port in modern Syria, was abruptly destroyed around 1190 BCE. Excavators found charred beams, collapsed roofs, and storerooms filled with goods awaiting shipment. Among the ruins were clay tablets, letters written in cuneiform, that capture a city in its final hours, appealing for help that never came. Ugarit was never rebuilt. Its harbour fell silent, swallowed by time. Quirky details surface in the ashes. At the site of Enkomi in Cyprus, archaeologists found a smashed bronze statue of a god, its pieces scattered amid collapsed homes. Was it toppled by invaders or by residents in a final act of desperation? In Mycenaean Greece, storerooms once filled with oil and wine now hold only ash. In some places, skeletons lie where they fell, suggesting sudden, violent ends. Each discovery adds a human note to what might otherwise seem like abstract collapse. Scholars still debate whether these layers of destruction all share a single cause. Were the Sea Peoples truly the destroyers of cities, sweeping across the Mediterranean like a storm? Or were they simply one thread in a web of disasters, earthquakes, droughts, rebellions, and the breakdown of fragile trade? In some cities, evidence points to invaders. In others, the damage could just as easily be explained by internal revolt or natural disaster. The pattern is tantalizingly uneven. Consider Hattusa, the Hittite capital, in central Anatolia. By the early 12th century BCE, it was abandoned. Unlike Ugarit, it shows little sign of fire or invasion. Instead, the city seems to have been deserted, perhaps after prolonged famine. Meanwhile, coastal strongholds in Canaan show abrupt burn layers, clear signs of violent conquest. The collapse was not a single event, but a mosaic of tragedies, each city falling for reasons both shared and unique. Yet the sheer scale of ruin is undeniable. From Troy in the northwest to Gaza in the south, fortified centres that had stood for centuries disappeared within a few decades. For those who lived through it, it must have felt as though the world itself was ending, and in a sense, it was. The great network of Bronze Age civilization, with its palaces, scribes, and sea routes, was breaking apart, leaving only scattered survivors. Merchants without markets. In the centuries before the collapse, the Mediterranean thrummed with trade. Ships carried copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, glass from Egypt, ivory from Nubia, and luxury goods from the distant edges of the known world. Palaces kept vast storerooms, not only for feeding their populations, but also for storing trade goods to be redistributed as gifts, payments, or sacred offerings. It was a system that tied kingdoms together in a fragile but glittering web. One solid fact anchors this vision: the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey and dated to the late 14th century BCE. Its cargo included nearly a ton of copper ingots, hundreds of jars of resin, precious scarabs, and even elephant tusks. This single vessel carried the lifeblood of Bronze Age civilization, the metals and materials needed to forge weapons, ornaments, and tools. Such ships were the arteries of empire. Yet by the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, these arteries began to clog. Quirky finds show this breakdown vividly. In Cyprus, storerooms were found packed with unsmelted copper ingots, ready for shipment but never sent. In Ugarit, unfinished orders for weapons remained on tablets, awaiting delivery that never came. It is as though merchants prepared their goods, but the ships no longer arrived. For traders, the collapse of markets was just as ruinous as the fall of cities. Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples were the cause or the consequence of this breakdown. Did their raids make trade impossible, forcing kingdoms into isolation and starvation? Or were they themselves refugees from collapsed economies, turning to the sea in desperation after markets dried up? The line between pirate and displaced merchant may have blurred as people adapted to survival in uncertain times. The ripple effects of this trade collapse were catastrophic. Ons required both copper and tin, materials that often travelled hundreds of miles before reaching a smith's workshop. Without secure routes, bronze production faltered, the weaponry of kings and the tools of farmers alike grew scarce. For rulers accustomed to equating power with metal, this shortage was not just economic, but existential. And so the grand web unravelled. Letters once sent between kings, addressing one another as brothers and exchanging gifts, ceased. Palaces that had depended on regular shipments could no longer support their retinues of scribes and artisans. Farmers, once sustained by imported grain, now faced drought and hunger alone. As we imagine the smoke rising from burned-out ports, we must also picture silent harbours, empty of sails, their markets bare. It was a collapse not only of armies and walls, but of trust. Trust that the world would keep moving, that ships would arrive, that letters would be answered, and in that silence the stage was set for newcomers upon the waves. Forgotten names on broken tablets. Amid the ashes of ruined cities, voices remain, not in stone, but in clay. Across the eastern Mediterranean, fragments of cuneiform tablets survive, often cracked and burned, recording desperate pleas and fading memories. These texts preserve names that would otherwise have vanished, giving us fleeting glimpses of the Sea Peoples and their contemporaries. They are whispers, faint but powerful, telling us what it felt like to live through collapse. One solid fact comes from Ugarit. In its final days, King Amurapi received frantic letters from allies. One reads, "The enemy ships are here, the cities are burning, there is no help from your armies." This tablet, baked accidentally in the city's destruction, froze a moment of panic in time. It shows us not just that Ugarit was destroyed, but that its rulers saw the threat coming and knew they could not stop it. And then there are quirky details, like the odd names scribes left behind. In Egyptian records, we find groups called the Sherdan, Shekelesh, and Peliset. Some of these names echo places we know. The Sherdan resembles Sardinia, the Shekelesh recalls Sicily, and the Peliset sound remarkably like the Philistines of later biblical texts. Were these actual connections to Mediterranean islands, or simply coincidences of sound? Scholars still debate whether these names reveal origins or only reflected Egyptian attempts to categorize the unfamiliar. Other tablets complicate the story. In Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, fragments describe shortages of grain and appeals for supplies from neighbouring lands. These weren't written as chronicles of war, but as administrative records, shopping lists of survival. The Sea Peoples are not directly named here, but the desperation is palpable. Starvation, political strain, and external raids may have converged in a spiral of collapse. Even Egypt's triumphal accounts at Medinet Habu are double-edged. Yes, they glorify Pharaoh's victory, but in recording the enemy's names, they immortalized groups otherwise lost. Without those inscriptions, we would never have heard of the Denyen, who may be linked to the Homeric Danaans of Greece, or the Chika, whose identity is even murkier. These fragments are like puzzle pieces scattered on the floor, tempting us with patterns yet always incomplete. Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples were truly a united confederation or simply a convenient label. Did they march under common banners, or did Egyptians lump together a dozen displaced groups under one menacing phrase? The tablets give no clarity, only a chorus of voices that fade mid-sentence. And so we listen to broken clay, and chipped stone, straining for meaning in words scratched by trembling hands. Names like Sheridan, Peliset, Denyen, ghosts etched into history's margins. They remind us that civilizations may fall, but the echoes of their fears and enemies can survive for millennia, waiting for us to piece them together. Ships with strange prows. The Mediterranean was always a sea of ships, yet in the reliefs and carvings that depict the sea peoples, their vessels stand out as something unusual, even alien, compared to the familiar barges and war galleys of Egypt. At Medinet Habu, Ramesses III's artists carved boats with high, curving prows that curl into elegant shapes, decorated like horns or animal heads. They seem to cut the waves with confidence, carrying warriors armed with spears, swords, and round shields. One solid fact comes from those same reliefs. The sea peoples fought both on land and at sea, suggesting they were skilled mariners. Egyptian accounts describe how they attacked in a great fleet, forcing Pharaoh's forces to defend the very mouth of the Nile. This was not a band of pirates in a single ship. It was an organized movement, large enough to threaten Egypt's survival. The quirky details of their ships have sparked endless fascination. Some scholars compare their curving prows to the later galleys of the Phoenicians, others to the ships of the Aegean. Archaeologists even point to peculiar horned carvings found in Sardinia, suggesting possible cultural links. One fringe theory suggests that the Sea Peoples pioneered shipbuilding designs later perfected by classical civilizations, placing them at a transitional moment in naval technology. Whether true or not, the imagery of their ships, sleek, decorated, and formidable, has become part of their enduring mystique. Scholars still debate whether these depictions are literal or stylized. Were the artists at Medinet Habu carefully recording what they saw, or exaggerating the strangeness of the invaders to make Egypt's victory more impressive? After all, Egyptian reliefs were as much propaganda as history, yet even if stylized, the images tell us that contemporaries regarded these ships as different, distinct enough to mirror it. Careful emphasis. Maritime archaeologists have long hoped to find a wreck that might confirm these designs. So far, no identified Sea People's ship has surfaced. Instead, we piece together clues: anchors recovered from the Levant, bronze rams from later centuries, stray timbers in silted harbours. For now, their vessels live only in stone, hovering between fact and imagination. But consider the symbolism. A fleet arriving with families in ox-drawn wagons suggests migration. Ships arriving with heavily armed warriors suggest invasion. The truth may be both, a maritime migration carrying not just warriors, but an entire way of life. As the Sea People's ships sailed into history, they brought with them both the terror of war and the uncertainty of displacement. And so, when we picture them, we must imagine the creak of wood, the flash of shields, the strange curves of ships unknown to Egyptian eyes, prows cutting across the Mediterranean like harbingers of change. Collapse of mighty Hatti. Among the empires that fell in this turbulent age, few collapsed as dramatically as the Hittites. From their capital at Hattusa in central Anatolia, the Hittite kings had commanded armies, forged treaties with Egypt, and ruled a sprawling domain stretching from modern-day Turkey to Syria. They were powerful enough to fight Ramesses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, a clash recorded as the earliest detailed military engagement in history. For centuries, Hatti was one of the great pillars of the Bronze Age world. One solid fact is clear. By the early 12th century BCE, Hattusa was abandoned. Archaeologists uncovered great fortifications, palaces and archives, but no evidence of rebuilding. The city, once filled with scribes and soldiers, had gone silent. Clay tablets end abruptly. The great halls stand empty, their stones weathered by centuries. Unlike Ugarit or Mycenaean palaces, there is little evidence of fiery destruction. Instead, it seems the city withered, emptied by famine, political fragmentation, or both. Quirky details lurk in the ruins. Excavators found lion statues that once guarded the gates, still fierce in expression but toppled and left half buried in soil. Inside the archives, tablets stop midstream as if scribes laid down their styluses and never returned. In one chamber, an unfinished draft of a treaty lies among broken fragments, suggesting negotiations that were never completed. These silent remnants capture the strangeness of a civilization that vanished without a final battle to mark its end. Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples played a role in this collapse. Some suggest migrating groups cut off the Hittites from coastal territories, starving the empire of grain and trade. Others point to evidence of prolonged droughts, confirmed by pollen studies in Anatolian lakes, which may have crippled agriculture. The Hittite Empire, stretched thin by wars and dependent on complex networks, may have simply crumbled under combined pressures. Yet hints of conflict remain. Egyptian inscriptions mention groups like the Luka and Sheridan, who may have once been vassals or enemies of Hatti. Did these groups turn against their overlords, perhaps joining the loose confederation we call the Sea Peoples? Or did the empire collapse first, creating space for newcomers to surge in afterward? The sequence is blurred, leaving us with a riddle of cause and effect. For those who lived in Hattusa's towering citadel, the decline must have felt like the slow extinguishing of a torch. The empire that once rivaled Egypt and Babylon faded into silence, its memory buried until rediscovered in the 20th century by archaeologists. The fall of Hatti reminds us that even great powers can vanish without fanfare, leaving only broken gates and forgotten treaties as witnesses. The Ugarit letters. If the ruins of Ugarit whisper of sudden destruction, its surviving letters speak in desperate shouts. This coastal city, perched in what is now northern Syria, was one of the jewels of the late Bronze Age. A hub of trade, culture, and diplomacy, it connected the Hittites, Egyptians, and Cypriots. Yet in its final days, Ugarit left behind an extraordinary archive. Clay tablets, baked not in kilns but in fire, preserved by the city's own destruction. One solid fact anchors the story. Among the letters found, one from Amurapi, the last king of Ugarit, reads with startling urgency, "The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my cities, and they do whatever they please. My troops are in Hatti, my ships are in Lycia. Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May you know it." Written to the king of Alatia, likely Cyprus, it is the cry of a monarch watching his world unravel in real time. The quirky details in these letters humanize the catastrophe. One message pleads for grain, another asks for a shipment of tin. Bureaucracy and diplomacy carried on even as danger pressed closer. A tablet recording an order of horses sits side by side with frantic appeals for help. Life continued until the very last moment, as though the machinery of state could not acknowledge the abyss opening at its feet. Scholars still debate whether these letters describe the Sea Peoples specifically. Were the enemy ships those of the Sheridan, Peliset, or Cheka, or were they local rivals exploiting chaos? The wording is vague enough to fuel multiple theories. Some suggest the enemy may have been mercenaries once hired by Ugarit itself, now turned against their employers. Others propose that they were part of the wider migrations sweeping the coast. The letters leave us on the brink of certainty, but never quite there. What is certain is that Ugarit did not serve. Excavations reveal blackened ruins, collapsed palaces, and storerooms full of goods that never reached their buyers. A tablet, half finished, still bears the marks of a scribe's stylus, cut off mid-sentence, frozen at the instant when destruction arrived. Unlike other cities that were rebuilt, Ugarit was never reoccupied. The silence that followed its fall was permanent. In these broken tablets, we hear the closest thing to eyewitness voices from the Bronze Age collapse. Kings begging for aid, merchants waiting for shipments, scribes recording orders that would never be fulfilled. They remind us that history is not just grand movements of armies, but the fragile attempts of individuals to hold their world together, one letter at a time. Famine, fire, and fear. Collapse rarely has a single cause. In the late Bronze Age, destruction swept across cities, but famine gnawed silently at the same time, turning hunger into a weapon sharper than any sword. The archaeological record hints at environmental stress, droughts that withered crops, shortages that left kingdoms scrambling for survival. In combination with raids, wars, and migrations, these natural pressures may have fueled a perfect storm. One solid fact stands out. Studies of pollen grains from lake sediments in Israel and Turkey show a sudden, prolonged period of aridity around 1200 BCE. Crops failed across the region, and letters from kings beg for grain shipments to stave off starvation. In Hattusa, records describe urgent appeals for food. In Ugarit's final days, pleas for supplies echo like cries in the dark. Famine was not a backdrop to war, it was a central player. Quirky details emerge in the archaeological record. In some destroyed sites, ovens filled with charred remains of barley loaves were found, abandoned mid-baking. At others, animal bones show signs of butchering unusual creatures, dogs, donkeys, even vermin, suggesting people turned to whatever food they could find. These fragments, so ordinary in their way, reveal extraordinary desperation. They remind us that while kings wrote of battles, ordinary people struggled simply to eat. Scholars still debate the relationship between famine and the sea peoples. Were these migrants driven by hunger, pushed from their homelands by drought? Or did their raids worsen shortages by severing trade and transport? Perhaps both are true. Cycles of scarcity creating desperate migrations, which in turn deepened scarcity elsewhere. The crisis may have spiraled outward, each failure feeding the next. Fire compounded the problem. Many cities were not just abandoned, but burned, their grain stores and supplies destroyed. Some speculate these fires were the work of invaders, others argue they were deliberate, a desperate attempt to deny food to enemies. Whatever their cause, the result was the same. Famine deepened, fear spread, and people fled. Fear itself left its mark. In Cyprus and the Levant, archaeologists have found hastily built fortifications, as if communities, sensing danger, threw up defences with whatever stones were at hand. These crude walls were no match for organised invaders, but they speak to the dread that haunted daily life. People did not know if famine or fire would strike next. They only knew that their world was unravelling. In the end, famine, fire and fear wove together into a net that caught entire civilizations. Armies could repel enemies at a riverbank, but no pharaoh or king could order the rains to return. Against hunger and uncertainty, even the greatest empires stood vulnerable, their fates as fragile as the crops in their fields, refugees or raiders. The Sea Peoples remain one of antiquity's most enduring enigmas, and at the heart of the debate lies a simple but profound question. Were they invaders bent on conquest or desperate migrants seeking survival? The evidence suggests they may have been both, depending on where and when they appeared. One solid fact comes from Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu. The Sea Peoples are shown not only as warriors with spears and shields, but also with ox-drawn carts laden with women and children. This is not the imagery of a raiding party alone. It suggests entire communities on the move, families uprooted, possessions packed, lives carried across the sea in fragile boats. It is migration written in stone. The quirky details of their presence reinforce this. In some sites in Canaan, the skeletal remains of newcomers show different burial customs from local populations. Pottery styles shift, with distinctive decorations and shapes appearing suddenly, unlike anything native to the region. Were these spoils of conquest or cultural signatures carried by migrants? The pottery, sometimes called Philistine ware, is decorated with spirals and birds that echo Aegean traditions. It is as though fragments of another homeland arrived alongside their ships. Scholars still debate whether these newcomers came as conquerors or refugees. Some argue they were mercenaries, seasoned fighters who once served Bronze Age kings, turning to piracy and invasion when their employers fell silent. Others see them as victims of collapse elsewhere, pushed to seek new lands by famine, drought, or war. Were they wolves at the door, or families fleeing a burning house? The lines blur when we remember that those categories are not mutually exclusive. A starving refugee can also be a fighter when survival demands it. The ancient Egyptians, unsurprisingly, chose to depict them as enemies. Pharaoh Ramesses III's inscriptions frame the Sea Peoples as aggressors defeated by his might. Yet those same reliefs betray the complexity of their arrival. Wagons of children, ships laden with entire households. The Egyptians may have seen them as invaders, but to themselves they may have been wanderers searching for a new beginning. This dual identity resonates with patterns throughout history. When the Goths crossed into Roman lands centuries later, were they refugees escaping the Huns, or raiders plundering Roman provinces? The answer, inconveniently, was both. The Sea Peoples may represent one of the earliest such migrations in recorded history, a mixture of humanity on the move, carrying war, culture, and desperation in equal measure. In the ashes of the Bronze Age, they emerge not as faceless destroyers, but as people caught between survival and conquest. Refugees or raiders? Perhaps they were both, and it was precisely that ambiguity that made them so unsettling to the empires they encountered. The Sardinian puzzle. Among the scattered names of the Sea Peoples, the Shurden, or Shardana, stand out. Egyptian inscriptions list them as fierce warriors, sometimes depicted with horned helmets and round shields. Their name has long intrigued scholars because of its uncanny resemblance to Sardinia, the island in the western Mediterranean. Could there be a link between this rugged land and the mysterious confederation that shook the Bronze Age? One solid fact is that Sardinia was home to the Nuragic culture, famed for its massive stone towers called Nurag. Thousands of these towers still dot the island, dating from around 1600 BCE onward. They served as fortresses, watchtowers, or perhaps symbols of clan power. When archaeologists excavated some of them, they found bronze figurines of warriors carrying round shields and horned helmets, eerily similar to the depictions of the Shurden carved at Medinet Habu. The quirky details of these Nuragic figurines are striking. Some warriors are shown with elongated, almost stylized weapons, while others carry curious helmets with tall crests or twin horns. These images bear a family resemblance to the Egyptian reliefs, fueling theories that the Shurden were indeed Sardinian seafarers, mercenaries, or migrants caught up in the turmoil of the age. Fringe ideas even suggest that Sardinian sailors ventured east in large numbers, lending their strength to the Sea Peoples' confederation. Scholars still debate whether the connection is real or a coincidence of imagery and sound. Could the Shurden simply have been a local group from the eastern Mediterranean, and the resemblance to Sardinia be accidental? Or did Sardinian mercenaries truly sail east, offering their services as fighters in Egyptian or Hittite armies before turning to raiding? Some texts hint at Shurden serving pharaohs as elite guards, suggesting their role may have shifted across decades from hired protectors to feared enemies. If the link holds, it would stretch the story of the Sea Peoples far beyond the Levant and Aegean, tying the western Mediterranean into the Bronze Age crisis. Sardinia, often thought of as remote, would suddenly emerge as a player in a world-spanning upheaval. It would also remind us that the Mediterranean was never a set of isolated regions, but a shared sea where ideas, goods and people could travel astonishing distances. The Sardinian puzzle remains tantalizing. Were the Shurden truly neuralgic warriors carried east by tides of migration, or are we chasing shadows, trying to force distant artifacts into a single narrative? Either way, the horned helmets of Sardinia and Egypt stand as twin echoes, stone and bronze whispering of connections we may never fully untangle. Philistines in the land, among the sea people's many names, one resonates with particular familiarity, the Peliset, widely identified with the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible. Their arrival in the southern Levant marked not only a demographic shift, but the birth of a culture that would loom large in later history. Where most sea peoples seem to vanish into silence, the Philistines left a lasting footprint, cities, artifacts, and stories that survived in memory for centuries. One solid fact lies in the archaeological record. Excavations at Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Gaza, and Ashkelon, the so-called Philistine Pentapolis, reveal layers of settlement beginning in the early 12th century BCE. In these layers, pottery styles suddenly change. The new wares, decorated with spirals, birds, and geometric motifs, strongly resemble Mycenaean Greek designs. This cultural fingerprint suggests the Philistines carried Aegean traditions with them when they settled in Canaan. The quirky details of their daily life give us glimpses into who they were. In Philistine sites, archaeologists discovered peculiar hearths shaped like bathtubs. Unlike local Canaanite designs, they brewed distinctive beer and raised pigs in greater numbers than their neighbours, a dietary habit noted with disdain in later biblical texts. One excavation even found finely painted craters, vessels used for mixing wine, which were both practical and symbolic of Aegean-style feasting. These touches of foreignness suggest not just invaders, but migrants who brought their kitchens, habits, and gods with them. Scholars still debate the exact nature of this identity. Were the Philistines truly Aegean migrants, a displaced branch of the Sea Peoples, or local groups who adopted foreign styles? Some propose a blend, newcomers marrying locals, blending traditions into something uniquely Philistine. Their biblical image as perpetual antagonists of Israel, most famously through tales of Goliath, may reflect not simply hostility, but the cultural otherness they represented in the eyes of their neighbours. Egyptian records at Medinet Habu list the Peliset among the defeated sea peoples, yet within decades they had carved out a permanent foothold in the Levant. This endurance sets them apart. While Hatti fell and Ugarit burned, the Philistines adapted, survived and flourished, creating a society that endured for centuries. Their legacy lived on in scripture, their cities anchoring stories of conflict and encounter that shaped religious imagination for millennia. In this sense, the Philistines illustrate how the Sea Peoples were not merely destroyers, they were also founders, transplanting cultures, establishing new communities, and reshaping the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the ashes of collapse, the Philistines built something new, reminding us that history's endings are often beginnings in disguise. Aegean connections. If the Philistines hint at links to the Aegean, the broader picture strengthens that possibility. In the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the world of Mycenaean Greece, the palaces of Agamemnon's heirs, the warriors sung about in Homer's later epics, also collapsed. Across the Greek mainland and its islands, citadels burned, palaces fell silent, and writing systems vanished. The great Linear B tablets, which had recorded inventories of grain and offerings to gods, ceased altogether. Greece entered its own dark age. One solid fact: sites like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos all show destruction layers dated to around 1200 BCE. At Pylos, the palace's storerooms were filled with hundreds of Linear B tablets, accidentally fired when flames consumed the archives. These tablets mention preparations for coastal defence, as though enemies were expected from the sea. Soon afterward, the palace was destroyed, and the administrative system that had governed the region disappeared. Quirky details point to cultural survival amid ruin. In later Philistine pottery, archaeologists note designs that strongly echo Mycenaean motifs, spirals, stylized birds, and even craters for communal drinking. Could these be the fingerprints of Mycenaean refugees who joined the migrations of the Sea Peoples? Some suggest that the Denyen, one of the groups listed in Egyptian records, may be related to the Danans, the Homeric name for the Greeks. If true, fragments of the Iliad's world may be hidden within the story of the Sea Peoples. Scholars still debate whether these connections are firm or fanciful. Were Mycenaean refugees truly part of the Sea Peoples, or did parallel collapses simply leave behind similar cultural debris? Some argue that Mycenaean mercenaries, once employed abroad, turned to raiding when their palaces crumbled. Others propose that displaced communities too go to the sea, carrying their traditions eastward until they merged with other wandering groups. The collapse of Mycenaean Greece also illustrates the interconnectedness of the Bronze Age. If Aegean palaces fell, it would send shockwaves across trade networks from Anatolia to Canaan. Grain shipments, luxury exports, and even military alliances would have faltered. The decline of one region became the crisis of many. In that sense, the Sea Peoples may represent not a single origin, but a gathering storm of displaced peoples, among whom Mycenaean survivors were just one thread. The idea of Homer's heroes drifting east, transformed into the enigmatic invaders carved on Egyptian walls, has a certain romance. Whether true or not, the echoes between Mycenaean collapse and the Sea Peoples remain too strong to ignore. In the great unweaving of the Bronze Age, Aegean threads were certainly pulled and perhaps rewoven into new patterns on distant shores, weapons of a new age. Amid the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse, one quiet revolution was taking place: the transition from bronze to iron. It was not immediate nor universal, but as cities fell and trade networks dissolved, the scarcity of tin, the rare ingredient needed to make bronze, forced communities to adapt. This technological shift altered the balance of power, changing how armies fought and how societies armed themselves. One solid fact is clear. By the early 12th century BCE, ironworking began to spread widely across the eastern Mediterranean. Excavations at sites like Philistine Ashkelon and Anatolian settlements reveal early iron tools and weapons, often crude compared to later craftsmanship, but already signalling change. Unlike bronze, which required far-flung trade routes to combine copper and tin, iron ore could be found more locally. In an age when long-distance trade faltered, iron offered a more resilient solution. The quirky details of this transition can be glimpsed in artifacts. Some of the earliest iron blades found in this period were not purely utilitarian, they were ceremonial, even magical. One famous dagger from much earlier, buried with Tutankhamun, was forged from meteoric iron, literally fallen from the sky. In the early Iron Age, such objects may have carried a sense of awe, as though new weapons were gifts of the heavens. Over time, however, iron became commonplace, reshaping the battlefield. Scholars still debate the extent to which the Sea Peoples themselves used iron. Some suggest they were among the first to exploit it, giving them an edge over bronze-dependent armies. Others argue that their weaponry, as depicted in Egyptian reliefs, still looks distinctly Bronze Age, swords, spears, and round shields typical of the era. If the Sea Peoples carried iron, it may not have been widespread, but even the beginnings of the transition hint at the dawn of a new military order. The implications were profound. Bronze weapons were expensive and often reserved for elites. Iron, once mastered, allowed broader access to arms. This democratization of weaponry may have fueled the rise of smaller, more agile groups like the Sea Peoples against older, palace-centered states. An empire that relied on centralized bronze supplies could be crippled, while newcomers with local iron ore could thrive. Seen this way, the collapse was not only a disaster, but a pivot. The great Bronze Age powers fell, yet from the smouldering ruins emerged societies equipped with new tools, new weapons, and new ways of waging war. The Sea Peoples may have been both destroyers and heralds, carrying the seeds of an Iron Age that would outlast them. The Pharaoh's narrow escape. For all the destruction that swept the Mediterranean, Egypt stood apart. It bent, but did not break. And the man who ensured that survival was Pharaoh Ramesses III, remembered not only for his monuments, but also for his desperate defense against the Sea People's onslaught. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu still preserves the story in stone, a visual chronicle of Egypt's brush with annihilation. One solid fact is that around 1177 BCE, Ramesses III faced a coalition of Sea Peoples who attempted both a land invasion through Syria and a naval assault at the Nile Delta. His inscriptions boast of victory. They were overthrown, scattered, and annihilated. Reliefs show Egyptian archers firing from fortified banks, while chariots thundered along the shore, cutting down invaders trapped in their ships. It was a rare, vivid glimpse of naval battle carved into temple walls. The quirky details of the encounter are fascinating. The reliefs depict the Sea People's ships crammed with families, women and children alongside warriors. Their vessels, with their curving prows, appear caught in chaos as Egyptian archers rain arrows down. In some scenes, the Nile's reeds and fish are carefully carved, as if to emphasize Egypt's home advantage. The invaders were foreigners, lost in strange waters. Ramesses' scribes ensured that every feathered headdress, every fallen enemy, became part of the pharaoh's glory. Scholars still debate the scale of this victory. Did Ramesses truly annihilate the invaders, or did he merely turn them away from Egypt while they settled elsewhere along the Levantine coast? Egypt endured, but only barely. Documents from Ramesses III's later years reveal economic strain, worker strikes, and grain shortages. The pharaoh's triumph may have been real, but his kingdom was not untouched by the wider crisis. What stands out, however, is that Egypt alone among the great Bronze Age powers survived with its political core intact. Hatti collapsed, Mycenaean palaces burned, Ugarit vanished, but Egypt remained a recognizable state. Ramesses III's victory at the Delta became part of that survival narrative, a story not only of military strength, but of resilience in the face of global upheaval. And yet, it was a narrow escape. Egypt's empire in Asia had already shrunk, its trade routes disrupted, its wealth diminished. The Sea Peoples may not have conquered the Nile, but they left scars. In the centuries that followed, Egypt would never again command the same sweeping power it had under earlier pharaohs. Survival came at the cost of decline. Still, in those carved walls at Medinet Habu, Ramesses III left a message for eternity, that when the world seemed to be unravelling, Egypt stood its ground. His was a fragile victory, but in an age of collapse, fragility was enough. Historians on trial. If the Sea Peoples haunt history, it is not only because of their actions, but because of the debates they have inspired. For over a century, scholars have argued about who they were, where they came from, and how much blame they deserve for the Bronze Age collapse. The mystery has turned history itself into a courtroom, with competing theories presenting their cases, evidence, and counter-arguments. One solid fact anchors the trial. The Sea Peoples are explicitly named in Egyptian records. Groups such as the Sherdan, Shekelesh, Peliset, Denyen, and Cheka are carved into hieroglyphs and reliefs. Their existence is undeniable. What remains uncertain is their origin. their cohesion, and their role in the destruction of empires. Did they topple cities directly, or did they simply move into a vacuum left by already faltering states? Quirky theories have emerged over the years. In the 19th century, some scholars proposed that the Sea Peoples were Trojan War survivors, wandering after the fall of Troy. Others imagined them as early Vikings of the Mediterranean, sea-born raiders who swept down on wealthy coastal cities. Still others suggested that they were displaced by natural disasters, earthquakes, droughts, even tsunamis, that pushed populations into motion. These ideas, colourful and sometimes fanciful, reveal just how tantalisingly incomplete the evidence is. Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples were primarily a cause or a symptom. Were they an invading confederation, systematically destroying kingdoms, or were they themselves refugees from collapsed societies like the Mycenaeans and Hittites? Some argue they were mercenaries once employed by those very states, turning against their masters when pay and food ran out. Others emphasize climate change, pointing to pollen studies and tree rings that suggest prolonged droughts, making them migrati, on's a consequence rather than the driver of collapse. In recent decades, new voices have reframed the debate, arguing that the Bronze Age collapse was not a single catastrophe, but a convergence of crises, famine, earthquakes, internal rebellions, and external raids. In this view, the Sea Peoples are not the villains of the story, but one thread in a tapestry of breakdown. Yet even here the mystery lingers. Why did Egypt record them with such emphasis if they were not central to the upheaval? The courtroom of history remains open. Archaeologists dig for new clues, linguists parse the names, and climate scientists analyse ancient sediments, all in pursuit of answers. But perhaps the Sea People's greatest legacy is the very uncertainty they left behind. They force us to confront the fragility of civilizations and the limits of our knowledge, reminding us that even with all our tools, some stories resist closure, echoes in later legends. When civilizations fall, their stories often echo long after the facts are lost. The Sea Peoples, though never named in Greek or biblical myth, may cast their shadows across tales told centuries later. Memory transforms into legend, and legend into epic, leaving us to wonder whether whispers of real migrations live on in the myths of wandering heroes and vanished isles. One solid fact is that the Greek world of the 8th century BCE looked back on the late Bronze Age with stories of the Trojan War. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey may not be literal history, but they preserve memories of a heroic age that had collapsed centuries earlier. In the wanderings of Odysseus and the tales of displaced warriors like Aeneas, some scholars hear faint echoes of migrations that reshaped the Mediterranean after 1200 BCE. The quirky parallels are striking. Egyptian inscriptions name the Denyen among the Sea Peoples, an uncanny resemblance to the Daenans, Homer's term for the Greeks. Another group, the Cheka, settled in Dor along the coast of Canaan. Later, traditions in the region spoke of foreign settlers who arrived by sea. Even the Atlantean myth, recorded much later by Plato, has been linked in fringe theories to memories of lost Bronze Age cities swallowed by catastrophe. Though highly speculative, these resonances invite us to imagine how oral traditions might have carried fragments of real displacements across centuries. Scholars still debate whether such connections are legitimate or illusory. Are we seeing genuine memory traces of the Sea Peoples, or projecting backward into myths that were never meant as history? Some suggest that the very idea of wandering heroes, from Odysseus to Aeneas, reflects a cultural memory of displaced peoples searching for new homes in the aftermath of collapse. Others warn against reading too much into coincidences of names and themes. Yet even if indirect, the parallels remind us that myth and memory often spring from lived experience. Aegean refugees settling in Canaan might, generations later, be remembered not as migrants but as giants, heroes, or strangers from beyond the sea. Egyptian victories against foreign fleets could, centuries later, echo faintly in stories of gods battling sea-born monsters. The Sea Peoples may never appear directly in Homer or the Bible, but the upheavals they embodied reverberated through the ancient imagination. Legends of lost cities, of migrations, of heroes cast adrift, all may be cultural aftershocks of a real crisis. In the end, myths are not archives, but they are memory's smoke, wisps of the fire that once burned, lessons from a vanished world. The story of the Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age collapse is not just a tale of ancient ruins. It is also a cautionary mirror reflecting truths about how interconnected civilizations can be both resilient and fragile. When we look back on those centuries of upheaval, we find lessons that feel unnervingly modern. One solid fact: the Bronze Age world was bound together by trade networks as complex, in their own way, as our global economy today. Tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, grain from Egypt, all moved along routes that stretched thousands of miles. Letters between kings called one another brother, linking Egypt, Hatti, and Babylon in a fraternity of rulers. Yet when one link broke, the chain unravelled quickly. The disappearance of ships from Ugarit's harbour or the absence of grain in Hattusa's stores was not local misfortune, but systemic failure. Quirky reminders of this vulnerability are found in everyday objects. In Cyprus, copper ingots shaped like ox hides still lie stacked in warehouses, prepared for journeys that never happened. In Mycenae, tablets record rations for workers who suddenly vanished when the palace burned. These traces of interrupted routines remind us that collapse begins not only with cities aflame, but with delayed shipments, empty markets, and unpaid labourers. Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples were a cause of this unravelling or simply a symptom, but in either case, their story highlights the fragility of systems built on far-flung interdependence. A drought in Anatolia, piracy in the Aegean, or rebellion in Canaan could ripple outward, much as financial crises or supply chain breakdowns do today. Civilization depends on trust, that ships will arrive, that rulers will respond, that the rains will fall. When that trust breaks, even mighty empires stumble. The lesson is sobering, the CPO. Please may have been wanderers, warriors, or both, but they remind us that migration and conflict are natural responses to scarcity and disruption. When climate changes, when trade collapses, when food fails, people move. Sometimes they flee as refugees, sometimes they fight as invaders, and often they blur those lines. The Bronze Age collapse shows how those movements can reshape entire regions. As we stand in our own interconnected age, dependent on global trade, vulnerable to climate change, and watching millions displaced by conflict or drought, we hear an ancient echo. The Sea Peoples are not just a mystery carved in stone. They are a reminder that civilization is always one shock away from transformation. Their vanished world still has something urgent to say to ours, the enduring mystery. And so we arrive at the heart of the enigma. Who were the Sea Peoples, really? After thousands of years, carved names, broken tablets, and scattered ruins give us only fragments. The Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Denyen, Checker, they remain shadows, glimpsed in Egyptian triumphs and archaeological puzzles, yet never stepping fully into the light. Their story is less a solved riddle than an enduring question. One solid fact grounds us. The Sea Peoples left a trail across history's most famous ruins. Ugarit burned, Hattusa emptied, Mycenaean palaces fell, and even mighty Egypt trembled. They were there, carved into Medinet Habu as enemies, remembered in letters as threats. The fingerprints of their migrations can be traced in pottery, burial styles, and sudden cultural shifts in Canaan and beyond. Something happened, something vast and transformative, and the Sea Peoples were at its centre. The quirky details of their memory add to the fascination. In Sardinia, horned helmet figurines echo their Egyptian images. In Canaan, Philistine feasting habits, beer, pigs, and spiral-painted pottery bear the stamp of foreignness. In Greek legend, names like Danaans ring uncannily close to Denyen. Each fragment feels like a clue in a detective story that has no final chapter. Scholars still debate whether the Sea Peoples were united or diverse, invaders or refugees, destroyers or founders. Were they the cause of collapse or merely swept along by it? Were they Sardinian mercenaries, Mycenaean wanderers, Levantine rebels, or all of the above? Every generation of historians reshapes the mystery, layering new theories upon old ones, yet none can silence the uncertainty carved into stone. Perhaps that is why the Sea Peoples endure. Their very obscurity fuels fascination. They are a mirror, reflecting our own anxieties about migration, climate, collapse, and survival. And they are a reminder that history is not always neat, that some stories defy closure. We live with their memory not because we know them, but because we do not. And so, the Sea Peoples remain what they always were to the Egyptians, strangers on the horizon, ships with curved prows, warriors and families moving together toward an uncertain shore. They erased empires, reshaped cultures, and then vanished into time. Their mystery endures, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a story that still asks questions of us here and now. Conclusion. The Sea Peoples were never a single tribe, nor a single answer. They were a phenomenon, fragments of societies in motion, threads of collapse woven into migration, war, and survival. They toppled cities, scarred empires, and left behind only scattered traces: pottery in Canaan, horned helmets in Sardinia, reliefs in Egypt. Their story is both ancient and startlingly modern, a tale of displaced peoples caught between desperation and conquest. We may never know their true names, or the exact shores from which they came, but perhaps that uncertainty is their legacy. They remind us that history is not only about what we know, but also about what we cannot recover. The Sea Peoples endure as a warning and a wonder, the lost civilization that erased empires, and the mystery that still sails, unsolved, upon the horizon of our past.